Alleluia. Om Mani Padme. Om Allah.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. And today we're speaking with David Leonard. He's the Manager of Community Engagement for the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria. Thanks for coming in, David.
Thanks, Norm.
Now, I've just used the title Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria. I have no idea what that is. Could you tell us about what it is?
Okay, Norm. It's a program that's part of the Department of Justice, and it provides a free mediation service. It used to be called the Neighbourhood Mediation Centre, but what we discovered is we were doing a lot more than just mediations, and it was a lot more than just neighbourhood.
Right.
So we will assist anybody who's got a dispute or a conflict if they're from Victoria. And it depends, there's a range of services that we provide. So we provide advice and information. We'll provide face-to-face mediation if it's needed. We also do training, education, community engagement.
Right. And you've been around it for a fair while, I heard you.
Yes, I've had a number of roles. So I started off as a dispute assessment officer, who are our frontline staff. They're the people who take the initial inquiries and help people get to that point of mediation. I'm a trained mediator with the service. I've been a training manager, and in my current role I do a lot of work with different community groups, capacity building and teaching. Okay.
Now, you mentioned there before you used conflict and dispute in the same sentence. Yes. Are they different?
Well, I guess a conflict can be any sort of underlying tension that can go on a kind of a scale. Where you get to a point where the conflict between two individuals starts to have an impact on how they're working or living together. So primarily the people who use our service when they get to a dispute, they'll be neighbours or work colleagues or people in a school community, where they find that the tension of the conflict, whatever that is, has reached a point where they can't communicate and they can't work together cooperatively. Clubs and associations are another kind of a group of people who might benefit from our service. So where the communication's broken down to a point where they can't move forward, that's a good time to call the Dispute Settlement Centre. So that's why I guess we say it's a dispute, where it's something it's a bit defined. We know who the individuals are. They've got some idea, they can articulate what the issues are, but they need help to find a solution. Okay,
right. Yeah, so it covers that span of incidents. As a dispute, the initial task that you took off on, what does that involve? You're a dispute assessments officer. Right. What do you do?
Right. Well, the first thing we do is we listen to people. So people contact us. We might either meet them in a court, they might be there for a hearing, or they contact our service. They've been referred by another service like council or local government or police. And we get a bit of a background of what's happened and what they've tried to do to resolve the dispute. So we're getting something very much from one person's perspective.
Yes.
We will we'll look at conflict coaching. So not providing legal advice, but thinking, okay, how have you approached this problem? When have you spoken to the other person? Why has it gone badly? So we get people to reflect a little bit on the steps that they've taken themselves. And we might work with questions that they might go back and try and negotiate themselves. Right. If that doesn't work, or if it's quite clear that they've had bad communication for a long period of time, then we can contact the other person. So the beauty about our service is there are no forms, there are no fees, and we do the work of contacting the other person and trying to get them to come to a meeting, which will be run by two of our mediators.
Right. Well, that's interesting. Just taking back one point, however, it's possible, isn't it, for me, if I've got an issue, just to ring directly? Do I have to be
Absolutely,
referred?
you don't need to be referred. About a quarter of the people who contact us are self-referred. They've just found us on the internet or recommendation of a friend. Unfortunately, a lot of people aren't aware of our service, so it's only when they've had to try and get advice from local government, local laws, police, lawyers, that someone suggested, look, maybe it's not the best use of your time and money to be pursuing this through a court-based process.
That's right.
Much better to have a meeting, a discussion through mediation, see if you can find a solution.
And it's probably also beneficial to because as soon as you see a uniform, police uniform or any other sort of uniform, there's a tension introduced potentially into what could be easily resolved.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of times people, when they get upset in a dispute, it's not just what the other person wants, it's how they approached the issue in the first place. When people get into a conflict, often the dialogue is around their rights. Who's in the right, who's wrong? And they want a very clear-cut, I'm right, you're wrong kind of answer. But in a lot of kind of the matters that we're dealing with, like neighbours, family, everybody's maybe in the right to a certain extent. I mean, to give you a very simple example between two neighbours, one person has a right to grow a tree in their property and enjoy the tree, the other person has a right not to have the leaf litter there.
Yes.
In some respect, they're both right. So if people can't resolve their disputes through a clear ruling, then they'll start to use power.
Yes.
So that's when they'll threaten legal action, or they'll get aggressive and they'll throw rocks over the fence, that kind of thing. So what we try to do as mediators is get people to actually think back to their interests, and preferably their common interests, the fact that they want to live in a neighbourhood in peace.
Yes.
They want to have an interaction with their neighbours that's positive, but they also want to be free of their leaf litter, or they want to enjoy their tree. So there has to be a way those two things can coexist.
Yes.
How does that happen? It doesn't happen through threats.
No.
Or through legal action. It happens through a discussion, understanding the other person's point of view. So that's what we try to do with mediation, is create that space.
Create the space. Yes. So, but the space that you create is it's not enforceable.
Yes.
But if you negotiate it properly, it'll enforce itself, I guess.
Yes. So and this is something that sometimes we explain it to people. It sounds.
I tell you, I need to explain something to you too, because I've just asked a long question and we're out of time. Right. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. We're speaking with David Leonard. He's a manager community engagement at the Dispute Settlement Centre for Victoria. David, before we were rudely interrupted my lack of attention to time, we were talking about the fact of how these agreements are not enforceable. So that's how do you handle that? What provisions do you make?
What we do is we tell people right at the start that the aim is to actually reach an agreement.
Yes.
And so the people who are going to enforce that are the people who sign that agreement or are party to that agreement. So it has to be their bright idea, basically.
Right.
The people who are involved in the mediation process go through 3 hours, and it's like a journey. There's various stages where they go through to get an understanding of where the other person's coming from.
Okay.
So there's, I guess, a lot of carrot and no stick, because the aim is to each of them to understand where the other person's coming from, and if offers are made and offers are accepted, it's because they understand that's the best deal they're going to get in the circumstances. I can give you a very brief example of two people who are arguing over a fence that had been built. One had built the fence without consulting the other neighbour and had wanted him to pay half.
Yes.
And unfortunately the dispute had ended up in court, and they came back to our centre And one gentleman said, well, I built a brand new fence, it's beautiful, you didn't contribute, you have to pay.
Yes.
The other person said, it's not about money, I can afford a fence, but I'm not going to give it to you because you don't follow the rules. But obviously they needed to resolve this, and it's people's desire to resolve disputes, which is what make the agreement work. So when we said, well, does it matter where the money goes? And the gentleman who wanted the money said, yeah, I don't care if he paid the money to charity, it doesn't have to go to me. I would feel better that he'd paid some money. And the other gentleman said, fine, if this will create peace, I'll make a donation. And that's what they did. They actually wrote a cheque for the amount. Now, as a mediator, I wouldn't have come up with that as a solution. I wouldn't have, when I read the brief before they came into the room, I wouldn't have thought that that would have solved, or I certainly wouldn't have suggested that to them as an idea. But because it was their idea, and because they both figured that they understood where the other person was coming from, that made a useful solution for them.
That's very interesting, David. And you mentioned before that in your training for mediation, there's various steps of which mediation goes through. Could you outline what they would be? So these people, take these people you just mentioned, they rock up, and what happens?
So we have an introduction to make everybody comfortable. They're in the same room together. There's usually a pair of mediators too, because it can go for 3 hours. It's quite a long process. And we hear from each of them to start off with. So we get them to tell their story to the mediators who haven't met the parties before. So that also enables the other person to listen. This might be the first time they've actually sat down and listened to the whole story from the other person. Maybe they've just had very anguished communication up to that moment.
Right.
We say, look, this is the point we agree to disagree, but we use that to write a list of issues then, and that breaks it down so that we can then take the various aspects, because usually there's been a history and there's a whole heap of different issues that have going on between neighbours. They might have contacted us about a fence, but in fact there's been a history of noise, or there's been a history of antisocial behaviour that's occurred between them. And it's the same with any other kind of dispute. So then the second part of the mediation is we actually have a dialogue about those issues. And that's where we start to do a bit of myth busting. So if somebody says that noise has been going on all the time, we actually get them to explain to the person how often all the time is. Or if they say you acted very aggressively, we get them to explain why they thought that person was acting aggressively, because they, in their own perception, might have thought they weren't acting aggressive at all. We still don't get them to agree to anything, they just get an understanding, and then we'll have a private chat to each of them. Then we get back together, and that's when we start looking for ways forward, once they understand what are some of the causes of the problem. So there'll be the initial things that they came to talk about, and there'll also be their ongoing relationship that they need to think about how that's going to work in the future.
So the example that you gave, which was a very good example, we're sitting in the room and you've gone through all that process. How did that, a donation to charity, how did that sort of arise? That just spontaneously with one of the parties? Or?
Well, I guess the mediators ask general questions. If somebody says, you know, the money is not to you, then we would ask them to explore that a bit further. Well, not to you, what does that mean?
Okay, yes.
But so we ask open-ended questions, we ask open questions to get people to think about what some of the possibilities are.
Right.
But it's important that we wouldn't say, I think you should pay money for charity, because it's not about us, the mediators, it's about them.
Yes. These types of disputes, what's the general magnitude of them in 12 months?
In terms of the number of contacts we get 20,000 contacts a year, but there'd be about 3,000 where we would actually intervene, make an approach, contact other people, and about somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 end up resolving either through discussions over the phone or face to face in a mediation. But it's not it's probably important to emphasise that we're not going to solve every dispute, because it depends on where we are, because we are dealing with people and people can be unpredictable, and we have good skills in explaining to people how mediation can benefit them, but they've got to make that decision, that step to come over and say, I'm sick of the dispute, I want to resolve it. And not everybody's at that space when the Dispute Settlement Centre contacts them.
Yeah, yeah.
So it happens in the context of our legal system. So people say, well, I've got other alternatives. If I don't want to address the issue and talk to my neighbour, I could sell my house and move. I could take legal action against them. Both of those have pretty serious consequences though.
Yes, yes they do. Well, we'll go to a break now, but I'd like to come back and talk about the art of listening, because that's obviously quite important. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with David Leonard. He's a manager of community engagement at the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria. And David, before the break, we were actually talking about an actual critical issue in all walks of life, is the art of listening.
Yes.
How do you manage that? Or is it part of your training?
Yes, it's definitely part of our training. When we're a registered training organisation and we have a 6-day course to train people to be mediators. Okay. And one of the first things we talk about is active listening. So that's the listening not just with your eyes but with your heart as well. And when we're running a mediation, we're creating an environment for listening. So it's not just the mediators being good listeners, but trying to encourage people to listen to somebody whose opinions they don't necessarily agree with, which is quite difficult. And then in our community engagement, so we often go out to the community, because as part of our brief is not just to resolve individual conflicts, but where possible to give people in the community capacity to prevent and manage their own disputes. And so active listening is always one of those cornerstones that we have in our workshops when we get people to reflect on their ability to listen. That's an important part of communication. I
think you've already partially defined it, but could we go back to active listening and succinctly describe what is active listening? Okay.
Well, listening is not just something you do with your ears. It involves your body language. It involves your ability to process information. So at the moment, you're non-verbal, you're nodding your head, and you're acknowledging what I'm saying. So that's part of that active listening. It's about making sure that when you are listening to somebody, you give them your full attention. So something that we as service providers ourselves can easily go off track. You can be listening, talking to somebody on the phone and looking at the computer and multitasking, and then you're not active listening.
That's right.
And that's crucial when somebody's already upset and they really need to express their needs. Active listening is a great way immediately to manage conflict.
Well, in that, there's also a personal issue, isn't there, of the sense that of forming likes and dislikes of individuals. So actually filtering yourself out of the listening process. Do you have a technique for that? Well,
it's interesting because mediators do have to be neutral and they have to present as neutral. So it's important that they're very consistent with their behaviour in a mediation setting. So when one person's telling the story, that yes, they are listening and they're taking notes, they're also checking in with the other people using eye contact to make sure that person doesn't feel that left out of the process. Maybe even getting people to move their seats so everybody's drawn in to the discussion. We make sure we set up the room so that everybody's got eye contact with everybody else.
Yes. So, all right, so we've got that, we've got everything set up and things are going along smoothly. Then there's a level of aggression arises. Right. How do you quell that?
Well, there's a few things that we can do. One of those is that we start off with getting everybody to agree to a set of ground rules. I probably didn't mention that at the start, that we're going to communicate respectfully. So we can just remind people they actually agreed to those ground rules.
Right.
Sometimes people are they're just getting wound up, so their voice is rising. So they're not actually saying anything disrespectful, but you can tell they're getting upset. So we can mirror calmness as mediators.
Yes.
And we can reflect back to people and say, look, it seems like a voice is getting a bit louder at the moment. Is everybody comfortable with that? And often just reflecting that will get people to calm down.
Yes, yes.
The other thing that we can do is we use reframing. So we use our listening skills. So if somebody's starting to say something, getting very worked up about things, we might just, as part of the conversation, take what they've said, summarise it, and get them to confirm, is that what we just heard you say? So then they feel acknowledged about what they've said. We've taken a little bit of the heat, and then we can use that to move a question to move forward. If people are getting very upset, we might call a break to say, look, at the moment everybody's a little bit upset here, let's take a 5-minute break. And we might all leave the room and sit separately, and everybody has a glass of water or a cup of tea. So there are various techniques we can use depending on the circumstances.
You mentioned 3-hour slots. Do you expect that you will resolve an issue in that slot, or can it go on? Do you have various opportunities?
Yeah, about 80% of our mediations, we do try to resolve them in that 3-hour slot. It's not a fixed 3 hours. There are all kinds of factors that might make it go a bit longer. If we have interpreters or we've got many people in the mediation, it might take longer. So we don't have a fixed time. But after 3 hours or 4 hours, then you might be getting to agreement by exhaustion rather than agreement by commitment. So if it's looking like it's going to take long, then we'll organise another session.
So the preparation's important, though, isn't it? In the sense that, do you strike situations where you've got the people in the mediation, but halfway through, one of them realises that in order to support themselves in their argument, they need someone else.
Yes.
And they bring someone else to be added? Does that happen? Yeah.
So in our service, and I think we're a bit different from other mediation services, that's the dispute assessment officer's task. So they would ask people, do you need a support person to come along?
Yes.
If people are distressed, or if they have a professional support person, they need someone, we try and organise that so there are less surprises at mediation as possible.
Yeah.
The mediators always have to think on their feet. They have to monitor the situation and make quick decisions in terms of where the direction of the mediation is heading. But so as much preparation as we can do beforehand, and certainly the very basics, like making sure that we have interpreters, making sure that we've got a suitable venue that's got good thermal comfort, all those kind of things.
Making decisions on their feet, David, I'm going to make one because we're running out of time. But would you be able to come back next week, because there's a lot that needs to be said here?
Yeah, I think I can.
That would be fantastic.
Great.
You've been watching Harmony and Diversity, and we'll be back next week, and we'll be speaking with David Leonard. Thanks for watching.
Shanti Om Allahu